Hi everybody, and welcome back to the second day of the UK PONI's annual conference. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us in this slightly more unusual format than what our conferences are usually run in. So we appreciate you all taking the time to participate today. Today's main focus is on developing and sustaining expertise in the nuclear field. The first panel is going to be looking at the challenges and solutions for this. We'll then later on be hearing from some UK PONI alumni who have engaged with and hopefully benefited from UK PONI's activities in the earlier stages of their career, kind of like a looking back on how UK PONI has supported their development. And then closing the day with a keynote by UN Under Secretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. So a really exciting few sessions for this second day. I'm particularly pleased to be chairing this opening panel as I think it really encompasses a large part of what UK PONI does and why UK PONI exists. But I think it's interesting to note that UK PONI and that mission is still clearly as relevant today as it was 10 years ago when it first set out. And because UK PONI is, still so relevant and actually continuing to expand, there's clearly a lot of scope for fresh thinking and new ideas, which I'm really excited to hear from our four panelists today. As well as everybody else who's going to hopefully be engaging in the Q&A part of the event. I also think opening the second day with this particular panel is a great way to follow on from a fantastic point made by Pippa Malmgren in her keynote at the end of yesterday's programme. She emphasised that our individual thoughts and processes are actually as much as part of the nuclear infrastructure as some of the more traditional ways or traditional parts of how we think about that infrastructure. And without individual thoughts and individual ideas, there's no nuclear infrastructure to continue. For me, this actually really raises some important questions about those thought processes, how they're formed and who by, and hopefully we'll be able to touch on some of that later today in our discussions. So to kick us off, we have four presentations. Each presenter has 15 minutes each, which hopefully leaves us with plenty of time for interactivity and discussion. So we'll kick off. Today we have with us Geoffrey Chapman, who is a PhD student from King's College London, Lorne Dryer, who is an incoming Politics and International Relations undergraduate, and Emily Enright, an MA candidate from KCL, and Matt Korda, who is a research associate from the Federation of American Scientists. We're going to take the presentations in that order as they're laid out in the conference programme. So I think without further ado, Geoffrey, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. So yes, Geoffrey Chapman, PhD student at King's College London with the Centre for Science and Security Studies. So today I will be presenting on the lessons that the British nuclear weapons establishment can learn from its historical experience when it comes to recruiting and retaining staff. If Britain is to remain a nuclear weapons state, then retaining a skilled nuclear workforce is essential. This is acknowledged in the UK government's 2015 Sustaining Our Nuclear Skills report, that states that there are substantial challenges to overcome. The nuclear workforce is ageing and attrition rates are high and growing as a result. This is true for Britain's nuclear weapons establishment, where these problems are not new. William Penny, often hailed as the father of the British bomb, warned in 1952 that the establishment could easily become sterile in 5 to 10 years unless we keep both the best of our top men and get an adequate supply of youngsters. Both constant recruitment and high retention of staff at AWE, formerly known as AWRE, are essential and have been perennial issues. As this presentation will make clear, many of these challenges are persistent and have contemporary relevance given the establishment is currently seeking to expand its workforce. This presentation will highlight how AWE can learn from its historical record in 3 areas, as well as where the establishment is breaking new ground in the present day. Recruiting staff quickly enough into the nuclear weapons programme was amongst the most important issues that Britain's initial atomic weapons effort had to overcome. In trying to identify blocks on recruitment, in 1953, Lord Cherwell identified a genuine dislike of AWRE work on account of its intrinsic character. The hazards of dealing with radioactive material and explosives were combined with poor pay, an inability to publish in academic journals, and potential unemployment if disarmament efforts were successful. For aspiring scientists, this made universities, the private sector, or other defence research establishments more appealing places of employment. Aldermaston's initial forays into non-nuclear weapons research were explicitly linked with an intended morale effect on staff to ease the switch to weapons from weapons work, if such a change is ever required, as a result of an arms control treaty. From the outset of the atomic program, William Penny realized that recruitment would have to be reliant on promoting all additional benefits that work at the establishment could offer. The atomic program's senior leadership noted that for new recruits, when the conditions of service are known, it is anticipated that not more than 5% would be possible starters. In the immediate post-war environment, this most prominently rested on offering access to government-subsidized housing. Therefore, rather than the technical issues associated with the bomb, according to the official history of the period, constructing houses became a major, almost obsessive anxiety. As work for the atomic program centered on the Aldermaston site from 1950 onwards, attention was paid towards creating an appealing community with schools, churches, and shops. Even the provision of a bus service to Aldermaston was both an additional benefit to staff and an initiative to increase the catchment area for labour in the Thames Valley region. In the present, AWE's recruitment literature strongly highlights the organisation's role in fostering a community and benefits like a 9-day working week cycle and extending home and flexible working arrangements. AWE's planned Centre of Excellence proposes to construct gym and library facilities with the aims of creating a campus-like environment for Aldermaston's employees. Perhaps the obvious solution to improve the appeal of working at Aldermaston is to offer better pay. This often proved intensely challenging to negotiate with the Treasury and was a task which occupied much of the establishment's senior leadership's attention. Pay increases for weapons establishment workers have often proven controversial, both within the weapons establishment, if not applied equally, or if not applied universally to other research establishments. The ability to pay wages flexibly with the justifications for both the transition to the atomic weapons program to the Atomic Energy Authority in the 1950s, and again from the civil service towards contractorization in the 1990s. Comparatively modest adjustments in wages and pensions have often had a disproportionate effect on the establishment's ability to recruit and retain staff, which directly determine its ability to deliver programs on time. When recruitment has been threatened, government has historically looked at new models of management. Although a necessity, strict secrecy is often at odds with the need to share information within the weapons establishment. Skills and knowledge must be passed on to the next generation for the nuclear program to continue. In the available archival material, this concern was expressed most clearly after the end of the Grapple nuclear tests in 1959. Having designed and tested many of Britain's nuclear weapons concepts, senior scientists were concerned with the incoming generation and how they were largely ignorant of nuclear weapons design principles compared to their American colleagues. This was due to a too strict enforcement of the need-to-know principle. As a senior British nuclear weapons scientist put it, the most valuable thing that the old hands can do at this present stage is to make sure that the new generation can in fact stand on their shoulders. As a result, an intensive effort was made to capture the experience of senior staff and pass it on to the next generation. Today, AWE continues to invest in extensive knowledge retention programs and must continue to educate new incoming cohorts from the staff with the remaining testing experience. Secrecy has also consistently acted as a deterrent to recruitment at the weapons establishment. Even in 1950, when obtaining security clearance to work at the nuclear establishment took 2 weeks, managers were still complaining of delays. The atomic program's senior management noted that by the time clearance had come through to the staff concerned, they'd usually found other work. Now it requires 6 to 12 months to acquire, develop, vetting clearance. Top graduates are likely to find alternative employment during that time. Although this cannot be lessened for work on the most sensitive projects, some level of provisional access, even if not directly on weapons work, was considered in both the 1950s and 1980s, when staffing issues were at their most acute. Perhaps the most important element that Aldermaston must maintain to ensure ongoing recruitment and retention is its safety record. Staffing levels will collapse if staff perceive that their safety is not robustly protected. This was clearly demonstrated after a series of radiological incidents in 1978, where 12 workers became contaminated with plutonium. As would be highlighted by the subsequent inquiry, these incidents were partly due to reductions in the number of safety staff. Poor safety created a vicious cycle where staff left the establishment, in turn leaving the establishment less able to make improvements. The situation received extensive prime ministerial attention, the introduction of a whole body monitoring initiative, and an extensive outreach campaign and special pay awards to induce recruitment and retention. Even so, this situation led to a year's delay in deploying Cheveling, reduction to the Thatcher government's nuclear weapons ambitions, and lingering difficulties in producing Trident into the 1980s. While no comparable incidents have occurred in recent times, AWE's safety record is imperfect. In the last decade, AWE has been fined twice for health and safety violations and has remained under enhanced attention of the Office of Nuclear Regulation since 2013. While the replacement of aging infrastructure will likely improve the situation, AWE must maintain a robust safety culture as being a fundamental prerequisite to continuing operations. One area where the nuclear establishment has made undoubted progress compared to its historical record is in diversity. Archival material demonstrates that despite the often serious need to improve staffing, the weapons establishment often implicitly and sometimes explicitly sought only male candidates. For instance, when Penny talked of needing an adequate supply of top men, this was literal. When AWRE started its apprenticeship scheme in 1952, only boys were recruited. In 1955, when faced with a severe recruitment shortage when undertaking the thermonuclear program, AWRE reluctantly recruited women, but considered it a dilution of their workforce. While gender diversity has gradually improved at the establishment as societal attitudes towards gender have changed, it is only relatively recently that AWE has undertaken active measures to improve inclusion and diversity. These efforts are now headed by a strategy group composed of the establishment's senior leaders. From a pragmatic perspective alone, this ensures that it can recruit from the widest talent pool possible. New initiatives include promoting diversity in recruitment, provision of unconscious bias training, the foundation of grassroots employee networks to promote gender, BAME, and LGBT inclusion, and the annual production of a gender pay gap report. For these efforts, AWE has won 2 awards for diversity in 2019. Even so, AWE's gender balance in 2019 was reported at 78 to 22 as a ratio of men to women across the organisation. In conclusion, the weapons establishment has always struggled with recruitment and retention necessary to deliver the nuclear programme. The establishment's historical experience suggests that overcoming this challenge can be achieved by maintaining a rigorous safety culture, offering the optimal working conditions and benefits, and reducing to whatever extent possible the pernicious effects of secrecy. These can often involve innovative and comparatively cheap programs to improve the attraction of the establishment to prospective and current employees. While divorced from the technical aspects of the nuclear program, the defence program can only be continued through ongoing investments in human capital. In this respect, efforts to increase diversity and inclusion are to be welcomed. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Geoffrey. I found that really interesting. It was great to kind of pull out those statistics on how things may or actually may not have changed, especially in the recruitment processes that AWE use. I will hand over to Lorne for his presentation.
Good afternoon. My name is Lorne Dryer. I'm hoping to start an undergraduate degree in politics in September. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to present research into how policy and media interact with the nuclear skills pipeline and set perceptions of the industry. To start with, I will provide a summary of the nuclear skills pipeline. Then, I'm going to look at the ways in which the government apprenticeship, defence, and education policy impacts the pipeline, before looking at the links between public perception and recruitment, and consequently, the media's impact on public perception. The nuclear skills pipeline needs 8,600 full-time employees each year, made up of 3 skill tiers, each with their own challenges to fulfill. Tiered 1 skilled workers require minimal nuclear-specific training, known as nuclearization, but they make up the bulk of the skilled workforce. They are highly transferable and in demand across many industries, not just nuclear, which may lead to shortages of engineers and project managers. On the other hand, Tier 2 skilled workers have nuclear-specific skills, meaning they are less transferable and likely to leave the pipeline. But they need between 5 and 20 years to train or gain experience before they can take up roles such as technical managers or senior engineers. Finally, the Tier 3 subject matter experts usually need at least 20 years of industry experience to perform nuclear-specific roles, such as principal scientists and engineers. This presents a significant recruitment and retention challenge for the industry, and whilst there has not been specific legislation to address the challenges, policy interacts with the pipeline in several areas. Starting with apprenticeships. Apprenticeship policy is intended to make apprenticeships an attractive and viable alternative to university education for skilled jobs. The government has tried to do this with actions like standardisation to make their qualifications more transferable, and through the introduction of the levy to provide a financial incentive to organisations. The Nuclear Skills Strategy Group's 2019 Nuclear Apprenticeship Survey found 44% of organisations increased their number of apprentices as a result of the levy, and 56% used the levy to assist retention by upskilling or retraining their workforce. Also, apprentices are classed as full-time education. Their ability to start at the age of 16 means that level 6 and 7 apprentices with tier 2 skills can progress through the pipeline earlier than comparable graduates, in theory leading to more tier 3 subject matter experts whilst working and alleviating skill shortages. As you can see, the policy is having a good effect on the pipeline, but the NSSG survey, amongst other publications, highlights how the policy could be more effective, as you can see in the graphs on the right. After feedback, the ability to transfer the levy was increased from 10% to 25%, but there is still a demand for more flexibility, both in the levy and the nature of the 80-20 on-the-job, off-the-job training structure. Whilst improved flexibility could increase its utilisation and make apprenticeships more beneficial to the pipeline, changes to the work-training ratio would enable employers to rapidly fill skill shortages for increased on-the-job training and may improve the transfer of tacit knowledge. Defence policy, on the other hand, appears to impact the pipeline in that it influences what skills are needed and helps provide tier 2 and 3 skilled employees to the civilian side of the industry. The University of Sussex Science Policy Research Unit has been undertaking research into the links between the civil and defence nuclear industry. Within their working paper, Understanding the Intensity of UK Policy Commitments to Nuclear Power, they have a subsection entitled, Are there Undivisible Linkages between the UK military and civil nuclear policy priorities? They undertook an extensive literature review which suggests nuclear new build policy is partially influenced by the need to maintain a UK-based defence nuclear skill set. To support this, they point to Hinkley Point C as an example of a new build project that was supported because of its supply chain and skill benefits for both the civil and defence nuclear industry. Furthermore, defence programmes such as the Nuclear Undergraduate Apprenticeship Scheme allow the defence sector to subsidise civil industry skill development. This is supported by the Institution of Engineers and the British Nuclear Energy Society's Evidence to the Engineering of Future inquiry, which states, many former nuclear submariners already occupy positions at all levels in the civil nuclear power and contracting industry, and this is likely to continue. Thus, the Royal Navy can be seen as a training ground for supporting the future UK nuclear power sector. Whilst this supports the idea that the Royal Navy is a consistent source for tier 2 and 3 skilled employees, the Dalton Institute's Evidence to the Engineering of Future inquiry highlights how the civil industry equally helps to develop defence nuclear skills. They state, the UK is not now in the position of having financial or personal resources to develop both programmes in isolation. And then, proceeding to give an example of a defence reactor that assists developing skills on a civil system before moving to classified work. Interestingly, the Dalton Institute also points out that, and I quote, this link does, however, need to be carefully managed to avoid the perception that the civil, military and nuclear programmes are one and the same. But, in terms of official policy, the Office of Nuclear Regulation Board meeting paper, ONR's contribution to the Public Sector Nuclear Skills Challenge identified 3 work streams that the Nuclear Industry Council could focus on to address the industry-wide challenge of recruitment and retention. To quote the paper, Workstream 1, Skills Coherence, will integrate the needs of the defence programme into existing cross-government and industry work to maximise the scope and value of skills training across the civil nuclear sector. Actions will be taken to refocus and introduce greater collaboration in the development of nuclear skills. Whilst it is unclear what regulatory action has been taken as a result of this, it strongly supports the suggestion that the UK's civil and defence nuclear programmes are dictated partially by the need to maintain and develop the skilled workforce. Finally, to quote the Rolls-Royce Small Modular Reactor marketing material, the expansion of a nuclear-capable workforce through a civil nuclear UK SMR programme would relieve the Ministry of Defence of the burden of developing and retaining skills and capability. Not only does this evidence the University of Sussex's Science Policy Research Unit and Engineering with Future Inquiry's findings, it shows the Office of Nuclear Regulation's workstream in action. This suggests defence nuclear policy has an impact on the nuclear skills pipeline and vice versa. However, education policy sets perception for its curriculum and encourages the study of science, technology, engineering and math, which supports the development of Tier 1 skills. Policy paper 2010 to 2015 Government Policy, Public Understanding of Science and Engineering, announced the Department of Education's policy to encourage STEM in schools and to improve public awareness in the hopes of reducing skills shortages. The effects of this can be seen in the graphs on the right. As you can see, STEM degree enrolments grew at a faster rate than non-STEM, but degrees which lend themselves to Tier 1 skills, like mechanical engineering and physics, grew even faster. This suggests education policy is getting better at providing the skills needed by the pipeline. It may also have an impact for its ability to shape public perceptions. Unfortunately, there is a disparity between the inclusion of nuclear subject matter in GCSE and A-level mandatory content. 2016 education reforms ensure GCSE students have a basic understanding of nuclear reactions and radiation, but this very limited coverage could easily lead to misconceptions about the safety of the industry. A-levels, such as environmental sciences and physics, on the other hand, provide comprehensive overviews of the impact of the UK nuclear industry. The physics A-level in particular emphasises the safety of the industry. Unfortunately, there's a lack of youth-oriented nuclear opinion polling data, and these changes are too recent to see an effect in enrolment or wider public perception. However, these changes may start to provide recruitment benefits similar to youth outreach programs like the Nuclear Industry Association's Regeneration Campaign, since public perception is believed to impact on recruitment. There has been convincing research done on the link between public perception of the industry and its recruitment. A Wellcome Trust literature review looked at what influenced young people and found that how useful they thought a subject was in terms of getting a job dictated what they studied. Importantly, this was shaped by curriculum. On the other hand, the Journal of Vocational Behaviour looked at job applicants and found that perception of the industry was one of the most influential factors in graduates seeking employment. Since the NSSG 2019 Nuclear Workforce Assessment, shown in the bottom left, shows 36% of trainees are direct graduates, improving public opinion amongst the young may aid recruitment. Another study by Cornell University also showed that what engineering students thought about industries influenced their career decisions. It showed that what they thought about industry was swayed by public perception. Since engineers make up a key component of all three skill tiers and are in demand across many STEM industries, engineering graduates' positive perceptions of the nuclear industry are vital. As for post-university recruitment, the International Journal of Selection and Assessment found recruitment is influenced by public opinion. Since almost 60% of staff came from outside the industry, not including trainees, this suggests that public perception may have a significant effect on recruitment into the pipeline, showing that there is convincing research for what people think about an industry determines how likely they are to try and work in that industry. This leads nicely on to the impact of media on the pipeline. Whilst I'm still waiting for data on applications from industry and the Ministry of Defence, so I am not yet able to evidence the link between public perception and recruitment, there appears to be a correlation between media coverage of the industry and public perception. On the right is a plot of the business, energy and industry strategy, public attitudes tracker data and sentiment analysis of all online news articles published by BBC, Daily Mail and Guardian that relate to UK civil or military nuclear issues from September 2012 to March 2018. The analysis was done manually, but verified with the Python Natural Language Toolkit to maintain consistency, whilst the Bayer's public attitudes tracking data consists of 48,302 survey responses over 22 quarterly surveys, averaging 2,100 responses per wave plotted. Blue shows the number of articles that leave a positive impression of the nuclear industry, and orange the number of negative articles. But in order to make the correlation slightly more visible, the net number of articles preceding each survey make up the red bars on the lower graph. The results of the survey suggest that media coverage is shaping public perception, and by extension recruitment into the pipeline. There are limitations for the survey. No distinction was made between a small article and front page coverage, and at this time I've only covered 3 of the most read online news sources, and have not yet addressed coverage from other sources such as television. This may serve to explain abnormalities, such as Wave 11, which saw an uptick in public perception of the nuclear industry, despite net negative coverage, presumably because there was the equivalent of front-page coverage that Hinkley Point C had gained approval, whilst multiple negative articles about EDF reactors remaining offline were less visible on cached copies of the BBC and Daily Mail websites. So there appears to be a correlation between media coverage and public perception, but more research is needed. In summary, apprenticeship policy directly supports and enables the development of Tier 1 and 2 skilled employees through mechanisms such as the apprenticeship levy. In contrast, defence policy ensures that the civil and defence nuclear industry skill sets are interoperable and share the expense as well as the benefit of developing Tier 2 and 3 skilled employees through programs such as the Nuclear Undergraduate Apprenticeship Scheme. Both of these policy solutions benefit from education policy, which encourages the development of Tier 1 skills through promotion of STEM and helps establish public perception of the industry. Finally, public perception aids recruitment, in particular amongst early career entrants into the pipeline. And, whilst more research is needed, there appears to be a correlation between news media coverage of the industry and public perception. This leads me to offer several recommendations. Whilst plenty of data on the industry is available, it is not easily accessible. A central exchange of industry data, similar to the IAEA INIS system or the Humanitarian Data Exchange, would help analysis and encourage more data collection. The GCSE curriculum could benefit from an emphasis on the safety culture of the nuclear industry to avoid misconceptions, and there's a lack of consistent but routine opinion polling over time on nuclear issues, particularly amongst youth. Additionally, difficulties with apprenticeship policy could be solved through the introduction of an industry-specific levy, similar to those in construction and engineering industries. This would enable nuclear apprenticeships to be more compliant with the needs of the pipeline, such as nuclearization. Thank you for your time and giving me the opportunity to speak at this conference.
Lorne, thank you so much. That was an excellent presentation covering an issue or a stakeholder in the nuclear complex that I think probably doesn't get as much consideration as it should do. The role of the media, as you point out, clearly is something worth to consider in this field, and we should probably do that a little bit more. So thank you very much for such an interesting presentation. Emily, I shall hand over to you.
So good afternoon, everybody. First of all, thank you to our terrific chair, Cristina, to my fellow panelists, and of course to the team at RUSI for this opportunity. My project for the 10th UK PONI annual conference is broadly on the topic of sustaining nuclear expertise in the next generation, and specifically examines the idea of the leaky pipeline in the policy community. First, a look at my presentation outline. I'll turn to my project aims and research strategy, then to the data set, and move to successes and risks for retention, and finish with some recommendations. This year's PONI conference call for proposals raised an issue that I'd encountered fairly uncritically before, the leaky pipeline, where early to mid-career professionals leave the field for various reasons after a promising start. At face value, this seemed like an attrition issue, one that could be addressed with the help of a workforce planning and organisational toolkit, but in reality, the picture is much more complex. Careers in defence and security, and in nuclear policy more specifically, seem to be becoming less and less linear, and there are multiple drivers informing this, from the funding models of think tanks and academic research institutes, to the changing workplace needs and expectations of younger cohorts, etc. I wanted to focus on the experience and views of today's early career cohort to generate a loose workforce profile and to gauge risks of attrition and opportunities for retention as they appear today. In order to really understand whether there is a leak in the pipeline, we would have to look at how careers play out, whether there is a pipeline, and I'm skeptical of this in the policy and research space, and whether we are seeing undue attrition at an unsustainable rate. This would have been a much bigger, much more complex project if I had had these aims, not one I could do justice to in this time frame and with so few respondents. However, answering these questions is what we as a community need to work towards. Instead, what I wanted to do was simply to get the ball rolling on this critical topic by collecting some new data, looking at macro level themes and commonalities, and identifying possible risks and opportunities. This was a small N qualitative study. I was not seeking significant replicability, nor a particularly large and representative sample. The study had 2 stages of data collection. The first was a short survey assessing reported factors increasing or decreasing likelihood of attrition from the nuclear policy field. The factors that I was testing for have been raised in workforce planning literature over the past several decades as being particularly impactful for retention, and thus are not specific to the broad nuclear field. Questions were not tailored to the policy and research group, so I was able to collect lots of great data from various industry players, enabling a good look across the silos to see common challenges, but also lessons learnt, and providing just a bit more analytic leverage. The second stage comprised a series of short, semi-structured interviews with some survey participants, as well as senior organisational leaders in academia, government, policy and industry to capture some top-down perspectives. These are off the record. So what does the data look like? The first key point of analysis was the loose workforce profile I was able to generate. Again, bear in mind that this was a small N study. As you can see here, I had 6 rough categories, and respondents were asked to self-identify as belonging to just one. I also asked more specific demographic data like age. My early career cohort was set at 30 and under, and of these, it was a fairly even split between the 23 to 26 and 27 to 30 brackets. Interestingly, the policy and research group had far more people in the 23 to 26 category than the 27 to 30 category. There could be a few different things going on here. This could be evidence of a leak in the purported pipeline, or it could be that people in the later age group don't really view themselves as early career anymore and thus chose not to participate. Moving on to gender, we had a fairly even split overall, but with slightly more women. It's also interesting to note that none of the 48 respondents self-identified as non-binary or any other classification of gender. We can break this down by sector as well. Academia and government were completely gender balanced, whereas policy and research has a large female majority. All of the military respondents were male, but there were only 4 of them. In industry, we had an interesting split going on between the UK deterrent category, which was majority female, and the energy and other category, which was majority male. We can also look at employment status. We can see the majority of respondents work full-time, but there are plenty of students in the cohort too, many of whom are also employed full or part-time. Respondents could select more than one option. Finally, I want to look at a pretty complex question, particularly to ask younger people. At this stage, how long do you intend to remain in the field? It was important to preface this question with "at this stage." There are so many factors affecting people's decision-making and career trajectories that, of course, this is more of a guessing game than an accurate indicator. I do think that this sort of forecasting activity sets the scene well for thinking about how a person's career could play out and what might impact this estimate. Uncertainty is clearly visible here with the plurality of unsure votes. Interestingly, 14% of respondents indicated that they intend to stay in the field for less than 5 years. We can look at this data by sector as well. Academia has a relatively diffuse spread. People are either unsure or are looking long-term. Government is similar. Policy and research, on the other hand, is clustered in the unsure or short-term categories, while no respondents in this sector were confident that they were still going to be in the nuclear policy field in the medium to longer term. Compare this to nuclear energy, where most respondents were confident that they'd be around for a while. What is important to figure out moving forwards with data like this is how attrition plays out in practice, not just in theory, and how much attrition is the right amount. For the next part of the presentation, I want to look at why policy and research is clustered at the left of this table and what we could do about it. So what are we doing well? Lots of things. These are pretty strong results from such a diverse sample, particularly given that this survey question was open-ended. Opportunities to attend conferences, flexible working, supported education and training, mentoring, and defined opportunities for progression came up repeatedly. Workforce design literature suggests that these factors are very valuable to employees and are clear drivers of successful retention. They have positive effects for workplace engagement, for mental health, for workplace culture, and for commitment to the organisation. These numbers are fairly strong, but we should be looking to get them higher. And just please note that this represents the initiatives that respondents both know about and find value in. Let's turn now to attrition risks and some of the factors that respondents identified might be associated with the decision to leave the field. Many of these will, I'm sure, be familiar to organisations in the nuclear field, but it's important to recognise that these are real concerns amongst junior staff. Concerns that emerge frequently include inadequate or undesirable pay, insufficient opportunities for development, diversification and promotion, insufficient number of positions in the field overall, and sector inertia. Diversity and inclusion came up in several surveys and in every interview. As with the retention initiatives on the previous slides, many of these factors are closely linked to mental health, workplace engagement, positive culture, and overall commitment to the organisation and its goals. Perhaps unsurprisingly, these responses were more highly concentrated in the policy and research sector. So what does this all mean, and where am I going with this presentation? Two very important questions. Looking at the data set as a whole, considering the views of the interviewees, and looking to what we know about best practices in workforce planning, I can see three overarching opportunities for organisations, particularly those in the policy and research area, but there are opportunities for improvement across the board. We can consider altering business practices. We can address the unique challenges provided by the size and relative insularity of the field. And we can consider ways to support and guide our early career cohort to navigate a changing career landscape. So on business practices, these are some of the more straightforward initiatives organisations could implement, and we've all heard many of these before. Changes in this vein are of course dependent on funding availability, executive sponsorship and engagement, and building these goals into the longer term plans of an organisation. Changed business practices could be things like increasing the number of and freezing early career positions, abolishing unpaid internships, which tend to feed and exacerbate inequality and exclusion, greater remuneration for junior staff, again, where possible, greater opportunities for professional development, focusing on employability as a whole, not just the skills needed to do the employee's current job, introducing frameworks for progressive responsibility and leadership, formalised goal setting to help high performance staff continue their development, and structured mentoring. There are lots of other opportunities here as well. There's plenty of evidence to suggest their value in terms of staff retention and well-being, but they also make good business sense in terms of cultivating a positive environment and a productive creative atmosphere and increasing attractiveness of the organisation to potential recruits. The research and policy groups are really small. I think we all know this, but that size is producing negative experiences for some early career staff that we need to manage. For one thing, competition is enormous for entry-level and early career positions. This is good and bad. It means that the people winning positions tend to be excellent, highly skilled, and highly decorated. It also means that each position comes with a high level of risk for the hiring organisation. If you only have one junior position available at a time and hundreds of applicants, it can be really difficult to take risks in terms of selecting people whose skills and experiences vary from those of their predecessors. This can lead to the same type of person being hired again and again instead of promoting greater diversity. In their 2015 article, Bayard and colleagues counter the myth that highly competitive job markets cannot support incidental discrimination. They can, and we need to be wary of this. Diversity and inclusion is, of course, a pressing issue in this community, as in many others. My respondents tended to agree that in the last several years, a focus on gender equality in the nuclear policy space has seen good results, but there are still adverse conditions and barriers to success being experienced by women at all stages of their career. Furthermore, there seems to be huge progress necessary towards the inclusion of people who are Black, Asian, and of other ethnic minorities, LGBTQI and non-binary people, and people who are not able-bodied or neurotypical. Finally, I believe that the highly siloed nature of the broader nuclear community is a barrier to the retention and effective development of the early career cohort. There was significant appetite amongst my respondents for experiences in different parts of the nuclear community, and I believe that there could be scope for an exchange of some sort to this end, to promote interdisciplinary thinking, whole of community problem solving, and greater diversity. The pipeline is something of a white whale amongst the younger cohort. There is significant appetite for certainty and security in terms of career progression and development that, at present, the market in the field cannot really deliver. We, as a community, need to find a way to respond to this. How can we meet the early career cohort in the middle when it comes to job continuity, predictability, and a pipeline? Guidance and support to make informed career choices, including dedicated career planning, is a great first step, but we can go further. We could think about what scope there might be to co-design career pathways in the nuclear space, allowing for uncertainty, flexibility, and movement, of course, between sectors of work and specializations outside nuclear. Facilitating experiences across the silos through some sort of exchange could be one element of this project. This reconceptualization might take time, but it's important to help next generation leaders think through and map out the possibilities before them. This will support retention into mid-career, but will also generate a wider pool of people across a few fields who can come in at the mid-career level with varied experiences and knowledge. Finally, a look at the way ahead. To start with, we need to be collecting more data. This data set simply scratched the surface. It's tiny, it's only 48 people. And we need to be asking more questions, collecting more views, and taking a really close look at what's going on in today's nuclear community. We need to look at our business practices and aim to make improvements where we can. We should think more laterally about the nuclear community, work to improve diversity and inclusion, and break down the silos. Finally, we could address the career development needs and concerns of the early career cohort. I learned when I was just beginning my training in presentations to always walk away having left one crazy idea out there, and this is mine. What would the nuclear community look like if we have a peak body? This is an Australian term for an advocacy group or trade association that works to promote the allied interests of a diverse but connected professional group. Such a body could be sponsored by government, for example, and could provide governance and support for nuclear community initiatives, work on issues in a centralised manner, facilitate career and pathway development projects, and provide a central voice for the community. This project has demonstrated that we are, on the whole, moving in the right direction, and we should take heart. But there is lots to be done to retain early career colleagues. I look forward to considering these and other challenges further and invite you all to do likewise. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. You raised some really interesting questions that I think a lot of us have been thinking about in the nuclear field, and how we can do better at addressing those challenges. So it's really great to have some data put behind some of those questions. So thank you very much for that. We shall move on to the final presentation from Matt Korda, who I feel is probably pretty highly caffeinated right now, given the time zone that you're in, Matt.
Yes, extremely. I was going to say good afternoon, but then it's morning here, and I don't know. I'm now like on my third coffee of the day, so it's great. But thank you very much for having me here. So if you've been in the nuclear community for even just a short time, chances are that someone has probably asked you at this point, how did you get started in the nuclear field? And what I find particularly interesting about that question is that for such a fascinating field of study, the answers are all kind of the same. Most people will say something like, I kind of just fell into it. And usually what they mean when they say that is that their initial interest in nuclear weapons was discovered and or cultivated during the pursuit of higher education. And so hearing the same answer over and over again got me thinking, does entry into the nuclear weapons field, or even just knowledge of nuclear weapons issues more broadly, depend on one's relative privilege, specifically in terms of access to higher education? And given the connection between higher education levels and higher income brackets, does that imply a divergence in how young people of different socioeconomic classes think about nuclear weapons? And so I think that's an important question, because opportunities to fill positions of political power tend to be restricted to those in higher education and income brackets. So it follows that if folks from higher socioeconomic statuses are the ones performing or advising the nuclear decision-making process, then it's possible that they are making decisions that the rest of their country's population neither understands nor supports. However, that's only the case if there actually is a significant divergence between how upper class folks and lower class folks, to put it bluntly, think about nuclear weapons. And so that's what I'm going to try and unpack in my remarks today. And we have a bit of new survey data to help us answer that question. So before we go to the data, I want to propose two competing hypotheses, both of which to me seem relatively plausible. So the first one is, given the uniquely existential nature of the nuclear threat, there's no significant variation in thought between socioeconomic classes regarding nuclear weapons. And so the idea here is because, you know, if the destruction of human civilization is, in a sense, like a great equalizer, then it might follow that class differences do not actually impact how we think about nuclear weapons, right? If nuclear war is putting the future of humanity at stake, then shouldn't we all feel the same way about it, regardless of socioeconomic status? And then I'm going to present the second hypothesis, which is folks from different socioeconomic statuses actually do think about nuclear weapons differently, not only in terms of their relative subject matter expertise, but also in terms of their relative assessments of the nuclear threat and their corresponding policy preferences. And so let's dive into that hypothesis a little bit more. And there was some wonderful recent analysis by Sarah Bidgood that demonstrated that there is, in the US context, an uneven distribution of WMD-related courses between public and private universities in the United States. And given that American public universities enroll significantly more people of color, first-generation college students, and students from low-income backgrounds, that implies a correlation between access to private university and entry into the WMD policy field, which, as Emily mentioned, tends to disproportionately exclude individuals from those particular socioeconomic circumstances. In addition, it's also understood that global crises disproportionately affect people of color as well as low income and vulnerable individuals. And that's certainly true for things like climate change and, as we're seeing right now, global pandemics, but the same would be true in the event of a nuclear war. As a result, it might follow that folks from lower socioeconomic statuses think about the threat of nuclear war quite differently and perhaps more viscerally than the middle or upper class folks who tend to study this issue at private universities. And so, as you can see, those two hypotheses are compelling and logical in their own way, and yet, in a sense, they're in sort of direct competition with each other. And so luckily, we have some new data to help us interrogate those hypotheses in a methodological way. And so in January, the International Committee of the Red Cross released the results of a comprehensive survey of millennials' views on war. The survey included 16,000 respondents aged 20 to 35 from 16 countries and territories. And by isolating the class-based factors of the survey in particular, which in this case are education and income levels, we can interrogate the data and see which patterns reveal themselves as to whether young people from different socioeconomic statuses do think about nuclear weapons differently. And so there's a ton of data to unpack in this survey, but just to narrow the scope a bit, I decided to exclude the respondents from non-nuclear armed states. And so not only because this is a PONI presentation and not a PhD, but also because I was concerned that mixing together the data from nuclear armed countries and non-nuclear armed countries would make it much more difficult to isolate class-based factors, which is what I'm really trying to do here. And the comprehensiveness of the data set from the ICRC, as well as the variance in their survey questions, they had about 10 or 11 different questions regarding nuclear weapons specifically, allowed me to ask a few kind of distinct questions of the data. So firstly, whether socioeconomic class factors into young people's assessments of the likelihood of nuclear war, and if so, whether class also impacts how young people view other nuclear-related issues like deterrence, non-proliferation, and disarmament. So the first question on the likelihood of nuclear war was, I thought, quite appealing because there are some similar data sets from the 1980s that allow for some really interesting comparisons. And so in those studies, American high school seniors not planning on attending college consistently had more pessimistic responses about the likelihood of nuclear war than those planning on attending college. And interestingly, that finding is echoed in the 2020 ICRC report, not just for the United States, but for all 5 nuclear armed states surveyed, which include the US, the UK, France, Russia, and Israel. And so across all 5 countries, when asked whether nuclear war was likely to occur in the next decade, a pretty clear pattern can be seen that respondents at higher income levels and education levels have much more optimistic views. They think nuclear war is less likely than their less affluent and less educated counterparts. And so why might that be the case? One possibility might be a sense of denialism among more affluent respondents. If you have more to lose, perhaps you're less inclined to believe that losing it is even possible. Another possibility is that higher class individuals, by virtue of their socioeconomic status, have inherently a greater sense of their own agency. And this was highlighted during the studies in the 1980s, during which one psychologist noted that, and I'm quoting, "Poorer children may appear less concerned about the arms race simply because they don't see any way to translate their concern into action. It's the same way they feel helpless about many aspects of their lives," unquote. And so regardless of the reason, given the implication that there does appear to be a class-based divergence in the assessment of the nuclear threat, wouldn't it then follow that there is a class-based divergence in how to best mitigate that threat? For example, through strategies like non-proliferation, disarmament, and enhanced deterrence. So let's examine each of those kind of threat mitigation strategies in turn, starting with non-proliferation. So when asked to comment on whether countries which don't have nuclear weapons should not develop or obtain them, the data shows that across the nuclear armed states, with the one exception of Russia, where the trend is not evident, respondents with higher education and higher income levels have more positive views of non-proliferation than those who receive less education and exist at lower income levels. On deterrence, when asked to comment on whether nuclear weapons are an effective instrument of deterrence, the results are a bit more mixed. Across the board, respondents in the highest income brackets had the most positive assessments of nuclear weapons as an effective deterrent. However, that doesn't always translate to a similar result amongst those with highest education levels. So in certain countries like the United States and Israel, respondents at higher education levels had a more negative view of nuclear deterrence, despite the fact that respondents at higher income levels in those same countries had more positive views. So now we're seeing a bit of a divergence in thought between education and income brackets. Turning to more disarmament specific questions, some responses appear to be correlated much more with other factors, perhaps with nationality, than with socioeconomic status. So for example, in the UK, respondents at higher education levels believe more strongly than those at lower education levels that countries which have nuclear weapons should eliminate them. But in France, it's the opposite. Respondents at higher education levels oppose disarmament much more strongly than respondents at lower education levels. That being said, certain questions revealed much stronger correlations between the class-based factors and a particular viewpoint. So for example, respondents at the highest income brackets across all 5 nuclear-armed countries had much stronger support for retaining their country's nuclear weapons than respondents at lower income brackets. Similarly, those at higher income brackets across all 5 nuclear-armed countries had a much more positive view that nuclear weapons make their country safer. And so what can we conclude from these results? I think a few things. So despite the connection between education and income levels, it does not always follow that those at higher education levels respond to questions in the same way as those at higher income levels. Same goes with those who exist at lower education and lower income levels. The second thing is that socioeconomic status does appear to play a role in affecting how young people from nuclear armed states perceive the threat of nuclear war, and in turn, how best to prevent it through strategies like deterrence, disarmament, and non-proliferation. And how does it play a role? Well, the responses from those at the highest income brackets appear to echo what is effectively the status quo for nuclear armed countries. So having positive views of both deterrence and non-proliferation and a negative view of disarmament is effectively national policy for all 5 nuclear-armed countries. And so one could hypothesize that this correlation is emblematic of the natural tendency between higher income earners to reinforce the system that allowed them to reach a higher socioeconomic status. However, that is just one potential explanation. I invite you to come up with others. And before I wrap up, I just want to note one thing in particular that I think is very important, because it's the strongest pattern that's evident in the data. For nearly every single question about nuclear weapons, no matter whether it was about deterrence, disarmament, non-proliferation, no matter what country the respondents were from, those at lower education levels consistently answered don't know to a much higher degree than those at higher education levels. And so this strongly reinforces the findings from Sarah Bidgood that I mentioned earlier, and indicates that a lack of access to nuclear weapons content at lower education levels is not just an American phenomenon. It cuts across all nuclear-armed countries. And if that continues, I think it's reasonable to conclude that a significant percentage of young people who do not attend university, either by choice or due to socioeconomic limitations, will have much lower levels of knowledge about nuclear weapons than their more educated counterparts, despite themselves living in nuclear-armed states. So to that end, if it's in our common interest to make the nuclear policy field more accessible and equitable, and additionally, if it is in your particular interest to challenge what I'm calling the nuclear status quo, then we should think about ways to reverse this trend and ensure that both knowledge about and influence on nuclear policy is not just limited to those in the highest education and income brackets. And I'll stop there.